If there's a young man in their 20s listening to this, how do they escape the pull of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground? With the eyes open to the world, how do they select the adventure?
So there's other characterizations of the divine, say, in the Old Testament stories. So one pattern of characterization that I think is really relevant to that question is the conception of God as calling and conscience. Okay, so what does it mean? It's a description of the manner in which your destiny announces itself to you. And I'm using that terminology, and it's distinguishable, say, from Nietzsche's notion that you create your own values. It's like part of the way you can tell that that's wrong is that you can't voluntarily gerrymander your own interests, right? Like you find some things interesting, and that seems natural and autonomous, and other things you don't find interesting, and you can't really force yourself to be interested in them. Now, so what is the domain of interest that makes itself manifest to you? Well, it's like an autonomous spirit. It's like certain things in your field of perception are illuminated to you. Think, oh, that's interesting, that's compelling, that's gripping. Rudolf Otto, who studied the phenomenology of religious experience, described that as numinous. The thing grips you because you're compelled by it, and maybe it's also somewhat anxiety-provoking. It's the same reaction that like a cat has to a dog when the cat's hair stands on end. That's an awe response. And so there's going to be things in your phenomenological field that pull you forward, compel you. That's like the voice of positive emotion and enthusiasm. Things draw you into the world. It might be love, it might be aesthetic interest, it might be friendship, it might be social status, it might be duty and industriousness. Like there's various domains of interest that shine for people. That's sort of on the positive side. God is calling, right? That would be akin to the spirit of adventure for Abraham. But there's also God is conscience, and this is a useful thing to know too. Certain things bother you. They take root within you, and they turn your thoughts towards certain issues. Like there are things you're interested in that you've pursued your whole life. There are things I'm interested in that I felt as a moral compulsion. And so you could think, and I think the way you can think about it technically is that something pulls you forward so that you move ahead and you develop. And then another voice, this is a voice of negative emotion, says, while you're moving forward, stay on this narrow pathway, right? And it'll mark deviations, and it marks deviations with shame and guilt and anxiety, regret. And that actually has a voice. Don't do that. Well, why not? Well, you're wandering off the straight and narrow path. So the divine marks the pathway forward and reveals it, but then puts up the constraints of conscience. And the divine in the Old Testament is portrayed not least as the dynamic between calling and conscience.
What do you do with the negative emotions? You didn't mention envy. There's some really dark ones that can really pull you into some bad places. Envy, fear.
Yeah, envy is a really bad one. Pride and envy are among the worst. Those are the sins of Cain, by the way, in the story of Cain and Abel. Because Cain fails because his sacrifices are insufficient. He doesn't offer his best. And so he's rejected. And that makes him bitter and unhappy. And he goes to complain to God, and God says to him two things. He said, if God tells him if your sacrifices were appropriate, you'd be accepted. It's a brutal thing. It's a brutal rejoinder. And he also says, you can't blame your misery on your failure. You could learn from your failure. When you failed, you invited in the spirit of envy and resentment, and you allowed it to possess you, and that's why you're miserable. And so Cain is embittered by that response, and that's when he kills Abel. And so you might say, well, how do you fortify yourself against that pathway of resentment? And part of classic religious practice is aimed to do that precisely. What's the antithesis of envy? Gratitude. That's something you can practice, right? And I mean, literally practice.
I think envy is one of the biggest enemies for a young person because basically you're starting from nowhere. Life is hard. You've achieved nothing, and you're striving and you're failing constantly because...
And you see other people whom you think aren't having the same problem.
Yeah, and they succeed. And they could be your neighbor, they could be succeeding by a little bit, or somebody on the internet succeeding by a lot. And I think that can really pull a person down. That kind of envy can really destroy a person.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the gratitude element would be something like, well, yeah, you don't know anything and you're at the bottom, but you're not 80.
Mhm.
You know, one of the best predictors of wealth in the United States is age. So then you might say, well, who's got it better? The old rich guy or the young poor guy? And I would say most old rich guys would trade their wealth for youth. So it's not exactly clear at all at any stage who's got the upper hand, who's got the advantage. And you know, you could say, well, I've got all these burdens in front of me because I'm young and oh my God. Or you could say, every dragon has its treasure. And that's actually a pattern of perception. You know, I'm not saying that people don't have their challenges. They certainly do. But discriminating between a challenge and an opportunity is very, very difficult. And learning to see a challenge as an opportunity, that's the beginning of wisdom.
It's interesting. I don't know how it works. Maybe you can elucidate. But when you have envy towards somebody, if you just celebrate them, so gratitude,
Yeah.
but actually, as opposed to sort of ignoring and being grateful for the things you have, like literally celebrate that person, it transforms, it lights the way. I don't know why that is
Absolutely.
exactly.
The only reason you're envious is because you see someone who has something that you want. Okay, so let's think about it. Well, first of all, the fact that they have it means that in principle, you could get it. At least someone has. So that's a pretty good deal. And then you might say, well, the fact that I'm envious of that person means that I actually want something. And then you might think, well, what am I envious of? I'm envious of their attractiveness to women. It's like, okay, well, now you know something about yourself. You know that one true motivation that's making itself manifest to you is that you wish that you would be the sort of person who is attractive to women. Now, of course, that's an extremely common longing among men, period, but particularly among young men. It's like, well, what makes you so sure you couldn't have that? Well, how about, here's an answer. You don't have enough faith in yourself. And maybe you don't have enough faith in, well, I would say the divine. You don't believe that the world is characterized by enough potentiality so that even miserable you has a crack at the brass ring. And like I talked about this actually practically in one of my previous books because I wrote a chapter called Compare Yourself to Who You Are and Not to Someone Else at the Present Time. Well, why? Well, your best benchmark for tomorrow is you today. And you might not be able to have what someone else has on the particular axis you're comparing yourself with them on, but you could make an incremental improvement over your current state, regardless of the direction that you're aiming. And it is the case, and this is a law, the return on incremental improvement is exponential or geometric and not linear. So even if you start, this is why the hero is always born in a lowly place, mythologically. Right? Christ, who redeems the world, is born in a manger with the animals to poverty-stricken parents in the middle of a God-forsaken desert, in a nondescript time and place, isolated. Well, why? Well, because everyone young struggles with their insufficiency. But that doesn't mean that great things can't make themselves manifest. And part of the insistence in the biblical text, for example, is that it's incumbent on you to have the courage to have faith in yourself and in the spirit of reality, the essence of reality, regardless of how you construe the evidence at hand. Right. Look at me. I'm so useless. I don't know anything. I don't have anything. It's hopeless. I don't have it within me. The world couldn't offer me that possibility. Well, what the hell do you know about that? This is what Job figures out in the midst of his suffering in the book of Job, because Job is tortured terribly by God, who makes a bet with Satan himself to bring him down. And Job's decision in the face of his intense suffering is, I'm not going to lose faith in my essential goodness, and I'm not going to lose faith in the essential goodness of being itself, regardless of how terrible the face it's showing to me at the moment happens to be. And I think, okay, what do you make of that claim? Well, let's look at it practically. You're being tortured by the arbitrariness of life. That's horrible. Now you lose faith in yourself and you become cynical about being. So are you infinitely worse off instantly? And then you might say, well, yeah, but it's really asking a lot of people that they maintain faith even in their darkest hours. It's like, yeah, that might be asking everything from people. But then you also might ask, this is a very strange question, is if you were brought into being by something that was essentially good, wouldn't that thing that brought you into being demand that you make the best in yourself manifest? And wouldn't it be precisely when you most need that you'd be desperate enough to risk what it would take to let it emerge?
So you kind of make it seem that reason could be the thing that takes you out of a place of darkness, sort of finding that calling through reason. I think it's also possible when reason fails you to just take the leap. Navigate not by reason, but by finding the thing that scares you, the risk, to take the risk, take the leap, and then figure it out while you're in the air.
Yeah, well, I think that's always part of a heroic adventure, is that ability to cut the Gordian knot. But you could also ask from an engineering perspective, okay, what are the axioms that make a decision like that possible? And the answer would be something like, I'm going to make the presumption that if I move forward in good faith, whatever happens to me will be the best thing that could possibly happen, no matter what it is. And I think that's actually how you make an alliance with truth. And I also think that truth is an adventure. And the way you make an alliance with truth is by assuming that whatever happens to you, if you're living in truth, is the best thing that could happen, even if you can't see that at any given moment. Because otherwise you'd say that truth would be just the handmaiden of advantage. Well, I'm going to say something truthful and I pay a price. Well, that means I shouldn't have said it. Well, that possibly, but that's not the only possible standard of evaluation. Because what you're doing is you're making the outcome your deity, right? Well, I just reverse that and say, no, truth is the deity. The outcome is variable, but that doesn't eradicate the initial axiom. Where's the constant, right? What's the constant?
It may be when you said Abraham was being fed by naked ladies.
That's an interpolation, obviously, but
wouldn't
have been out of keeping for the times.
But it does make me think, sort of in stark contrast to Nietzsche's own life, that perhaps getting laid early on in life is a useful starter. Step one, get laid and then go for adventure. There's some basic conventional satiation of base desires.
I think it's perfectly reasonable to bring the sexual element in because it's a powerful motivating force and it has to be integrated. I don't think it's adventure. It's romantic adventure.
Right. But the lack of basic interaction, sexual interaction, I feel like is the engine that drives towards that cynicism of the incel.
It is,
in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground.
There's very little doubt about that. We know perfectly well anthropologically that the most unstable social situation you can generate is young men with no access to women. That's not good. And they'll do anything to reverse that situation. So that's very dangerous. But then I would also say there's every suggestion that the pathway of adventure itself is the best pathway to romantic attractiveness. And we know this in some ways in a very blunt manner. The Google boys, the engineers who are too, what would you say, naively oriented towards empirical truth to note when they're being politically incorrect, they wrote a great book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, which I really like. It's a very good book, and it's engineers as psychologists. And so they'll say all sorts of things that no one with any sense would ever say that happen to be true. And they studied the pattern of pornographic fantasy, and women like pornographic stories, not images. So women's use of pornography is literary. Who are the main protagonists in female pornographic fantasy? Pirates, werewolves, vampires, surgeons, billionaires. Tony Stark, you know.
Yeah.
And so the basic pornographic narrative is Beauty and the Beast. Those 5 categories. Terrible, aggressive male tameable by the right relationship, hot erotic attraction. And so I would say to the young men who, and I have many times to the young men who are locked in isolation, it's first of all, join the bloody club, because the default value of a 15-year-old male on the mating market is 0. And there's reason for that. And 0 is a bit of an exaggeration, but not much. And the reason for that is, well, what the hell do you know? Like, you're not good for anything. You have potential, and maybe plenty, and hopefully that'll be made manifest, but you shouldn't be all upset because you're the same loser as everyone else your age has always been since the beginning of time. But then you might ask, well, what should I do about it? And the answer is, get yourself together. Stand up straight with your shoulders back, take on some adventure, find your calling, abide by your conscience, put yourself together, and you'll become attractive. And we know this is, we know this is true. The correlation between male sexual opportunity and relative masculine status is about 0.6. That's higher than the correlation between intelligence and academic achievement. I don't think that there's a larger correlation between two independent phenomena in the entire social science and health literature than the correlation between relative male social status and reproductive success. It's by far the most fundamental determinant.
Well, what's the cause and effect there?
It's a loop. Men are motivated to attain social status because it confers upon them reproductive success. And that's not only cognitively, but biologically. I'll give you an example of this. There's a documentary I watch from time to time, which I think is the most brilliant documentary I've ever seen. It's called Crumb. And it's the story of this underground cartoonist, Robert Crumb, who was in high school, was in the category of males for whom a date was not only not likely, but unimaginable. So he was at the bottom of the bottom rung, and almost all the reactions he got from females wasn't just no, it was like, are you out of your mind? Like, with that contempt, right? And then he became successful. And so the documentary is super interesting because it tracks the utter pathology of his sexual fantasies because he was bitter and resentful. And like, if you want to understand the psychology of serial sexual killers and the like, and you watch Crumb, you'll find out a lot more about that than anybody with any sense would want to know. But then he makes this transition, and partly because he does take the heroic adventure path, and he actually has a family and children, and he's actually a pretty functional person, as opposed to his brothers, one of whom commits suicide, and one of whom is literally a repeat sexual offender. It's a brutal documentary. But what he did in his adolescence, after being rejected, was he found what he was interested in. He was a very good artist. He was very interested in music, and he started to pursue those sort of single-mindedly, and he became successful. And as soon as he became successful, and the documentary tracks this beautifully, he's immediately attractive to women. And then you might ask too, even if you're cynical, it's like, well, why do I have to perform for women? And the answer to that is something like, why the hell should they have anything to do with you if you're useless? They're going to have infants. They don't need another one. Right? Partly the reason that women are hypergamous, unless they want males who are of higher status than they are, is because they're trying to redress the reproductive burden. And it's substantial. I mean, the female of any species is the sex that devotes more to the reproductive function. That's a more fundamental definition than chromosomal differentiation. And that's taken to its ultimate extreme with humans. And so, of course, women are going to want someone around that's useful, because the cost of sex for them is an 18-year-old period of dependency with an infant. So I think the adventure comes first.
Heroic adventure comes first.
It's complex because the other problem, let's say, with the Crumb Boys is that their mother was extremely pathological and they didn't get a lot of genuine feminine nurturance and affection.
Oh, of course. So the family and society are not going to help you most of the time with a heroic adventure, right? They're going to be a barrier versus a catalyst. In good
families, they're both, because they put up constraints on your behavior. But I've interviewed a lot of successful people about their calling, let's say, because I do that with all my podcast guests. How did the path that you took to success make itself manifest? And the pattern's very typical. Almost all the people that I've interviewed had a mother and a father. Now, it's not invariant, but I'd say it's there 99% of the time. It's really high. And both of the parents, or at least one of them, but often both, were very encouraging of the person's interests and pathway to development.
That's fascinating. I've heard you analyze it that way before, and I had a reaction to that idea because you focus on the positive of the parents.
Yeah.
I feel like it was maybe I see biographies differently, but it feels like the struggle within the family was the catalyst for greatness in a lot of biographies. Maybe I'm misinterpreting it.
No,
but
I don't think I think that that's a reflection, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's a reflection of that dynamic between positive and negative emotion. Like my son, for example, who's doing just fine. He's firing on all cylinders as far as I'm concerned. He has a nice family. He gets along with his wife. He's a really good musician. He's got a company. He's running well. He's a delight to be around. He was a relatively disagreeable infant. He was tough-minded. And he didn't take no for an answer. And so there was some tussle in regulating his behavior. He spent a lot of time when he was 2 sitting on the steps trying to get his act together. And so that was the constraint. But that wasn't something that was, it's an opposition to him away because it was in opposition to the immediate manifestation of his hedonistic desires. But it was also an impetus to further development. The rule for me when he was on the stairs was, as soon as you're willing to be a civilized human being, you can get off the stairs. And you might think, well, that's nothing but arbitrary, superego, patriarchal, oppressive constraint. Or you could say, well, no, what I'm actually doing is facilitating his cortical maturation. Because when a child misbehaves, it's usually because they're under the domination of some primordial emotional or motivational impulse. They're angry, they're overenthusiastic, they're upset, they're selfish, like it's narrow self-centeredness expressed in a immature manner.
But see, okay, tell me if I'm wrong, but it feels like the engine of greatness, at least on the male side of things, has often been trying to prove the father wrong or trying to gain the acceptance of the father. So that tension where the parent is not encouraging, like you mentioned, but is basically saying, no, you won't be able to do this.
So my observation as a psychologist has been that it's very, very difficult for someone to get their act together unless they have at least one figure in their life that's encouraging and shows them the pathway forward. So you can have a lot of adversity in your life. And if you have one person around who's a good model and you're neurologically intact, you can latch onto that model. Now, you can also find that model in books. And people do that sometimes. Like I've interviewed people who had pretty fragmented childhoods who turned to books and found the pattern that guided them in, like, let's say, the adventures of the heroes of the past, because that's a good way of thinking about it. And I read a book called Angela's Ashes that was written by an Irish author, Frank McCourt. Fantastic book, beautiful book. And his father was an alcoholic of gargantuan proportions. He just, an Irish drinker who drank every cent that came into the family, and many of whose children died in poverty. And what Frank did, is a testament to the human spirit, is he sort of divided his father conceptually into 2 elements. There was sober morning father who was encouraging and with whom he had a relationship. And then there was drunk and useless later afternoon and evening father, and he rejected the negative and he amplified his relationship with the positive. Now, like he had other things going for him, but he did a very good job of discriminating. And I mean, partly the question that you're raising is, to what degree is it useful to have a beneficial adversary? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, struggle-free progress is not possible. And I think there are situations under which where, you might be motivated to prove someone in your immediate circle wrong. But then that also implies that at some level, for some reason, you actually care about their judgment. You just didn't write them off completely.
Well, I mean, that's why I say there's an archetype of a young man trying to gain the approval of his father.
Mhm.
And I think that repeats itself in a bunch of biographies that I've read. I don't know, there must have been an engine somewhere that they found of approval, of encouragement. Maybe in books, maybe in the mother, or maybe the role of the parents is flipped.
Well, my father was hard to please. Very.
Did you ever succeed?
Yes. But it wasn't easy, ever.
When when was the moment when you succeeded?
Late, pretty late. Like 40, maybe later.
Was it gradual or a definitive moment when a shift happened?
My father was always willing to approve of the things I did that were good, although he was not effusive by any stretch of the imagination, and the standards were very high. Now, I was probably fortunate for me, it does bear on the question you're asking, is like, if you want someone to motivate you optimally, God, it's complicated because there has to be a temperamental dance between the two people. Like, what you really want is for someone to apply the highest possible standards to you that you're capable of reaching. Right? And that's a vicious dance, because you have to have a relationship with your child to do that properly. Because if you want to be optimally motivating as a father, you keep your children on the edge. It's like, you might not reward something in your child that you would think would be good in someone else because you think they could do better. And so my father was pretty clear about the idea that he always expected me to do better. And was that troublesome? It was like, I felt often when I was young that there was no pleasing him, but I also knew that wasn't right. See, I actually knew that wasn't right, because I could remember, especially I think when I was very young, that I did things that he was pleased about. I knew that was possible. So it wasn't unpredictable and arbitrary. It was just difficult.
It sounds like he's hit a pretty good optimal, but it's for each individual human that optimal differs.
Well,
And
that's why you have to have a
hard.
relationship with your children. You have to know them, and well, with yourself too, and with your wife. You can't hit that optimal. That optimal is probably love. That's because love isn't just acceptance. Love is acceptance and encouragement. And it's not just that either. It's also, no, don't do that. That's beneath you. You're capable of more. And how harsh should that be? It's like, that's a really hard question. Like, if you really love someone, you're not going to put up with their stupidity. Don't do that. One of the rules I had with my little kids was, don't do anything that makes you look like an idiot in public. Why? Because I don't want you disgracing yourself. Why not? Because I like you. I think you're great. And you're not going to act like a bloody fool in public so that people get the wrong idea about you. No.
What about inside a relationship? How a successful relationship is, how much challenge, how much peace? Is a successful relationship one that is easy or one that is challenging?
I would say to some degree that depends on your temperament. My wife is quite a provocative person. And there are times when I suppose, there are times when I casually wish that she was easier to get along with. But as soon as I think about it, I don't think that.
Yeah.
Because I've always liked her. We were friends ever since we were little kids. And she plays rough. And I like that, as it turns out. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't a pain from time to time. But, and that is going to be a temperamental issue to some degree. And an issue of negotiation. Like, she plays rough, but fair. And the fair part has been establishing that's been part of our ongoing negotiation.
And part of it is in the play, you get to find out about yourself or what your temperament is. Because I don't think that's clear until it's tested.
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. You find out all sorts of things about yourself in a relationship. That's for sure. Well, and partly the reason that there is provocativeness, especially from women in relationship to men, is they want to test them out. It's like, can you hold your temper when someone's bothering you? Well, why would a woman want to know that? Well, maybe she doesn't want you to snap and hurt her kids. And so how's she going to find that out? Ask you? Well, you're going to say, well, I'd never do that. It's like, never, eh? Let's find out if it's never. So we don't know how people test each other out in relationships, or why exactly, but it's intense and necessary.
What's in general should a man's relationship with temper be?
You should have one, and you should be able to regulate it. Like, that's part of that attractiveness of the monstrous that characterizes women's fantasies. Right? Because, and Nietzsche pointed this out too. To go back to Nietzsche,
Yeah.
Nietzsche, one of Nietzsche's claims was that most of what passes for morality is nothing but cowardice. I'd never cheat on my wife. It's like, is there anybody asking you to that you actually find attractive? Or are there dozens of people asking you to that you find attractive? It's like, well, I would never cheat. It's like, no, you just don't have the opportunity. Now, I'm not saying that everyone's in that position, that they would cheat even if they had the opportunity, because that's not true. And it's the same with regards to, oh, I'm a peaceful man. It's like, no, you're not. You're just a weak coward. You wouldn't dare to have a confrontation, physical or metaphysical. And you're passing it off as morality because you don't want to come to terms with the fact of your own weakness and cowardice. And part of what I would say is twisted pseudo-Christian morality that Nietzsche was criticizing was exactly of that sort. And it tied into resentment and envy. And he tied that in explicitly. Said that failure in life, masked by the morality that's nothing but weak cowardice, turns to the resentment that undermines and destroys everything, and that does that purposefully.
Yeah, I think he was criticizing if under the facade of niceness, there's an ocean of resentment.
Yeah, that's for sure. That for sure. That's also the danger of being too forthcoming with people. See, this is another thing, let's say, about my wife, who's not particularly agreeable. It's like, she's not particularly agreeable, but she's not resentful. And that's because she doesn't give things away that she isn't willing to. And if you're agreeable and nice and you're conflict avoidant, you'll push yourself too far to please the other person. And then that makes you bitter and resentful. So that's not helpful.
Do you think you'll be in trouble for saying this on a podcast later?
No, we know each other pretty well. And like I said, it's a trait that I find admirable. It's provocative and challenging.
And it seems to work.
Well, we've been together 50 years, so